Good morning, students. Today we will talk about separation of powers, constitutional foundation and contemporary relevance in India. First, we will try to understand why it is in use. The Vice President of India recently emphasized the principle of separation of powers and asserting that in a democracy, governance must be carried out only by the executive. So the Vice President says that the governance will be carried only by the executive. So this executive, who is elected by the people and accountable to the people. And the Vice President also cautioned that any overlap or encroachment by one organ of the state into the domain of another threatens the democratic fabric. Right? We know that recently the Supreme Court has clearly given a verdict, and Supreme Court clearly entered into the discretionary powers of the President and governors. In response, even the President also used her power under Article 143 to take an advice from the Constitutional Court, that is Supreme Court. So in this context, let us see why separation of powers and what is separation of powers. We know that the principle of separation of powers refers to division of functions and powers of the government among three independent organs, right? The one is legislature. The second one is executive. And the third one is judiciary. Right? The legislature, which is responsible for lawmaking, oversight and representation. The executive is responsible for implementing laws and administering the governance. And the judiciary, which is responsible for interpreting laws and dispensing justice. This tripariate division, that is legislature, executive and judiciary, ensures a system of checks and balances. Right? Preventing a concentration of power in one institution, thereby safeguarding democratic accountability and also individual liberty. And if we can see a little historical background to this separation of powers, the Aristotle, who was the first identified, Aristotle, who is the first one to identify the three branches of the government, and according to him, the branches are deliberative, magisterial and judicial. The modern articulation came from the Montesquieu in his seminal work, The Spirit of the Laws. After Aristotle, then Montesquieu in his work, The Spirit of the Laws, which was written in 1748, just for your information. And he advocated for separation of powers as a bulwark against any tyranny which is to be created in the society. Now we will see separation of powers in India. Separation of powers in India. India does not allow a strict separation, but rather a functional separation with significant overlap between the organs of legislature, executive and judiciary, which is tailored to suit its parliamentary democratic structure. So in this context, let us examine what are the various constitutional provisions, right? The Constitution also does not explicitly demarcate powers but assigns a specific roles under various articles. The first article you have to remember is Article 50. So which comes under directive principles of state policy. The separation of judiciary from the executive. This article talks about separation of judiciary from executive. The summary of Article 50 says this. And in Article 121 and 211, these articles says that it prohibited discussions in parliament or state legislatures on the conduct of the judges, right? And another article in this context is Article 53 and 154. These articles says that executive power is vested in the president and governor respectively. So that is 53 is about president, 154 is about governor. Now if you can see the practical overlaps actually. Now the executives are part of legislatures, right? Executives are part of legislatures in India. Now you can see that the ministers who are the part of the legislature as well. Now if you can see the second one, legislature's judicial role, because the legislature, from the constitution, the legislature has the power to impeach the judges and also for the breach of the privilege, and they can inquire and they can order some kind of the inquiry committee through its parliamentary committees. They can do that. The third one is even judiciary also can do some kind of the legislative role. So judiciary is taking legislative role. Even if you can see that the guidelines which are laid down in Vishaka versus state of Rajasthan and directions in environmental jurisprudence and many other cases also, judiciary is directing the legislature to do this. So now if you can see the judicial interpretation regarding the separation of powers, that is very important for your exam. What is judicial interpretation and how the judiciary interpreted? The Supreme Court has repeatedly recognized separation of powers as part of the basic structure. So first we have to understand the separation of powers itself. It is the component of the basic structure doctrine. And even in Keshavanand Bharati case also, it is clearly reaffirmed that the separation of powers is the part of the basic structure of the constitution. Even in Indira Gandhi versus Raj Narayan case, it again reiterated its sanctity. Even in Minerva Mills case versus Union of India, it is also asserted judicial review itself as a basic feature of the constitution. And even in Roger Matthew versus South Indian Bank, in the judgment also, the Supreme Court clearly emphasized the importance of judicial independence in tribunal formation. So there are so many other interpretations as well. And if you can see some of the, for your information, just I will write here, you may refer it later. So Indira Gandhi versus Raj Narayan case. Here also they said that separation of powers. And Minerva Mills versus Union of India. And another important case is Roger Matthew versus South Indian Bank. All these cases are very much important when you are writing some mains answer about the separation of the powers. And even you can quote some of the reports and recommendations. For example, the Sarkaria Commission in 1983 and also the Poonchi Commission in 2007. The both commissions clearly emphasized the clear boundaries between the legislature and executive roles should be existed, especially between the center and the states. They clearly recommended that. The one more thing you can quote in an examination is Law Commission of India report. Law Commission of India report, that is 272nd report. It urged reforms in tribunal appointments to restore the separation. So the Law Commission clearly urged there should be reforms in the tribunal appointments, because the current appointments of the tribunal largely the state legislatures or the center has largest say compared to the judiciary. So the Law Commission clearly says that they urged reforms in the tribunal appointments also to restore that separation. But if you can see the challenges to separation of powers in India, we will also see with some examples. The first and foremost challenge to the separation of powers is judicial overreach, which means that the judiciary is reacting more than what it needs to be, which means that the judiciary is coming out of its boundary. For example, recently the Supreme Court ordered for the reforms in the Board of Cricket Control in India, and it involved with the NEET examination, right? So Supreme Court's recent direction to the President on the timelines for the assent, these are all comes under the judicial overreach. The second one is legislative encroachment is also there. We cannot say only judicial overreach. Legislative encroachment is also happening, right? So because we know that how the judicial appointments will happen in India through the collegium system, right? So the legislature clearly enacted a law which is National Judicial Appointment Commission, NJAC. And this act clearly give a certain kind of an advantage to the executive to involve in the selection of the judges. So that's the reason the National Judicial Appointment Commission struck down in the Supreme Court in the case of Supreme Court Advocates on Record versus Union of India case for violating the judicial independence. The third one, even executive sometimes overreach, right? Every time we are talking about the judicial overreach only, but please try to understand, when you are trying to talk about the separation of powers, you should know about the legislative overreach and executive overreach as well, along with the judicial overreach. So for example, if you can see the executive overreach, proliferation of ordinances without parliamentary debate. Simply the executive, that is the president, is issuing ordinances to make the law immediately to be effective, and if the law is not, if the ordinance is not becomes a law in the parliament, again they are making the continuation of ordinances. Continuously they are issuing ordinances. So when the bill is not becoming law in the parliament, means it does not get major support, but still the government want to do it. So it is doing in the root of the ordinance, because the president is finally, he is the person who can give the ordinances. So proliferation of ordinances without any parliamentary debate, that is also indirectly an executive overreach only. So executive dominance also in tribunals and regulatory appointments, that is also not to be expected. Understood? So we need to maintain some kind of the balance actually between legislature, judicial and executive, because the every institution has to restrain itself. Each organ must stay within its constitutional mandate. Strengthening parliamentary oversight is very much important, because India is a parliamentary democracy. So we must reduce the ordinance route and enhance committee scrutiny. So because the committees are very much important, the scrutiny is very much important, public suggestions are very much important. Without having all these things, simply you're introducing an ordinance and just applying it on the country, it is not a right way actually. So some kind of the tribunal reforms are also should be done, because most of the time in tribunals the legislature and executive having, especially the executive has a lot of say compared to the judges. So these are all. So in this context, maybe in the examination point of view, You can also talk about the judicial activism versus judicial overreach. You can think about this as well, because most of the time when the public interest litigation bills are coming to ensure social justice, excessive judicial mandates can breach this separation, because the Supreme Court wanted to do some justice. By the time the outcome of that justice looks like the judiciary is overstepping its boundary. So these are all coming actually. So, and one more thing is, you can even refer the Administrative Reforms Commission report, ARC. So because even the second ARC committee report also clearly says that there should be a role clarity, there should be a reduction in executive overreach and the judicial restraint. Understood? So this is all. And some of the important articles, if you can see for the prelims, you can think about Article 123, that is ordinance making power of the president, and you can take Article 124 clause 4 and 217 parliament powers to impeach judges. And also you can refer certain cases like Vishaka guidelines and Vishaka versus state of Rajasthan case. I'm talking about, these are all important to have a more clarity as an aspirant, if you can see, right? And one more case you can refer is L. Chandrakumar versus Union of India, because in this case the Supreme Court reaffirmed that judicial review as a part of the basic structure invalidated provisions limiting any power of the Supreme Court or High Court over tribunals, right? So that one also you have to be thorough about it. And Article 50, please read it, because Article 50 is something where it directs the state to separate the judiciary from the executive, right? And if you want to, if there is any political science and international relations students are there, you please try to understand the concept of this separation of powers with John Locke arguments, because we know that John Locke or John Locke, whatever you can call, in his 2 treatises of government, he talked about the separation of powers. So even if you are a non-PSIR student, but still you can use this guy and you can have some idea on what exactly John Locke told in the 2 treatises of the government. Just you can briefly write some 2 to 3 points, you can use it for the mains answer writing, because finally the writing separation of powers is not that much difficult in the examination, but you have to write it with more convincingly. So that conviction will come only when you are quoting with some statistical data. The UPSC is looking for an analysis, that's absolutely right, but that should be backed with the facts, right? So that's why you have to read and memorize all these things. And tomorrow we will come with another video.